So welcome everybody to Startup Grind Chilliwack. This is our February edition. Yeah. And like I've said before, it's all about education, inspiration, and connection. And I was just at the global conference in Redwood City in Silicon Valley this past week, and it was pretty cool. About 200 new directors just like me were there. And this organization has grown to 640 chapters worldwide. Yeah. And the values across the country, across the world, are make friends, give first, and help others. And that's really a universal theme for Startup Grind worldwide. And we have three wonderful sponsors that have been with us from the beginning. SEPCO, the Chilliwack Economic Partners Corporation, Accelerator, and UFV. So let's give a big hand to our sponsors. And at the partner level, we've got Cowork Chilliwack, Currency Marketing, Wisebox Solutions, and BC Urban Wine Club. So those folks have given in kind. So let's hear it for them. And I've got somebody special on deck here, Eddie Tam. She's from SEPCO, and she's going to say a few words about why SEPCO is involved with Startup Grind.
Well, why SEPCO involved with Startup Grind is an opportunity for us to partner at the grassroots level. We're the Chilliwack Economic Partners Corporation, and we're the economic development organization for the city of Chilliwack. So our mandate is to help facilitate and attract economic growth. So part of our mandate is to work with businesses that are looking to come into Chilliwack, existing businesses, but also with entrepreneurs. So this is a great platform for us to support this initiative where entrepreneurs can come together and really support each other. So that's why we're proud to be part of the Startup Grind.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Nettie. I will relieve you of your chair now.
Thank you.
And if you are doing anything online, use the hashtag StartupGrind. And like I said, that'll go to the global community and be part of that. So Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and whatever else is happening these days. Like I said, I was in Redwood City last week, which is about 20 minutes south of the San Francisco airport, right in the heart of Silicon Valley. And it was interesting to hear the origin story of Startup Grind itself. So this thing started 7 years ago. Derek Anderson, he's a young fellow who wanted a group of like-minded people. His first meeting had 4 people, and then it grew from there. And then someone in LA said, hey, can I start one of these? And it really mushroomed. They did their first global conference 6 years ago with 200 people. And this past week, they had 8,500 people there. And they had some real notable folks. The woman at the top there, she's the CMO, the Chief Marketing Officer for Google. You've probably heard of that startup. The fellow in the top right, he's the president and CEO of Y Combinator, the world's largest incubator and really at the heart of launching corporations and startups. And I'm in that picture somewhere. This fellow is one of the founders of Airbnb, so it was really cool to hear their stories and try to relate it to our world. But one of the most impactful stories for me was a fellow that came to Startup Grind Global last year. His name's Mohammed, and he's from Somalia. He was enthralled with trying to take entrepreneurship and innovation back to Africa and was really a whirlwind of activity. And what's interesting and really sad was, because he was doing this and empowering especially women to start businesses, he was murdered in October. And so we as a country kind of take it for granted that we can start things, fulfill our dreams, and around the world, that's just not the case. And so that really kind of struck home for me. But that was a fellow just like us. My roommate for the week was a fellow from Ahmad from Sudan. So it was pretty cool to see all of these chapters, just like Chilliwack, nurturing entrepreneurship. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest for tonight, and it's Dr. David Harper. He's the Director of Innovation and Entrepreneurship with UFV. We'll walk through David's career as a science educator, researcher, and technology CEO. We'll also dig into his new role as a catalyst of innovation and entrepreneurship at the UFV. Everybody on their feet. Let's give him a huge Startup Grind Chilliwack welcome. Come on up, David. Great.
Standing ovation by command. I like that.
Exactly. That's the way we roll.
That's the way it usually works for me.
Well, welcome to Startup Grind
Thank you.
Chilliwack.
Thank
I
you. Great
really
to be here.
appreciate you coming.
Well, I'm totally happy to be here. This is my first time in this space, and what an amazing job you've done, Tim,
Well,
with
thank
this
you.
space. I'm
Thank you.
really impressed. My wife works in television. I see a lot of studios and that sort of thing all the time. I've been to lots of generators and incubators and startup places, and this is just first class, absolutely. So Tim's just done a great job, don't you think?
Thank you. Well, this isn't about me. This is about you today, but I appreciate that. We had some time to chat, and it's a really fascinating story, trying to see what your journey is. But if you go back in time, you're an educator first. Where did you get that inkling to be that, and where did you end up going to school?
That's an interesting question, because I was talking about this not too long ago, about how I ended up in the life sciences and in human anatomy and physiology. That's my education. That's what I teach at University of the Fraser Valley, health courses and anatomy, physiology, and pathology. And I've just written a book, and one of the things we're looking at is how I came to that. And it was a movie called Fantastic Voyage, which is, does anybody remember that movie, Fantastic Voyage? Okay. In the 60s, right, where this guy had this, some world famous scientist guy had some brain injury, and the only way they could fix it was to shrink these scientists down microscopically, inject them into a vein, and they had this, and they travel. So you went through the whole human body. And so that combination of the human body and science, that just sort of really tickled me. And I think also growing up in the 60s, there's been a lot because of Apollo. You know, this is the anniversary for Apollo. I grew up as a space ager and with Jacques Cousteau and with National Geographic and all that sort of thing. I was just really interested in science and nature right from the start. So I like to say I followed the path of least resistance. I just did stuff that I thought was interesting, and it eventually ended up being a PhD and a couple of postdocs, and now back here teaching the next generation or generations at UFV.
Wow. So roll that back. Where was your first post-secondary education?
Graduated, I like to say proudly graduated. I'm Vancouver born in North Vancouver, educated, graduate of Carson Graham High School, and then UBC. So I went to UBC, I did my undergraduate there, and then I also did my graduate work there as well. It was not that usual to do that in those days, but I managed to skip a master's degree and go right into my PhD, and from there, postdoc to Woods Hole, which is in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and then I spent 2 years at Cambridge University in the UK.
Wow. So let's look at each of those. What did you learn at UBC? Like, not everything you learned, not every class. I don't want to see your schedule, but what were some key takeaways?
Well, you know, my supervisor, Bob Blake, was great at the end of it and doing my PhD thesis. I owe a lot to him, but I think I learned about how science works, how I learned that it's important to be curious all the time. And I guess, you know, those kids are always asking you questions about stuff. We should never stop doing that. Just always wondering how things work, how we can make them better. That's sort of at the heart of innovation, is curiosity. And I learned critical thinking. I learned the important aspects of not just, you know, reading, doing, writing exams, but actually thinking and thinking about big things. But I gained confidence myself along that journey. That I think really anybody, given the time and energy, can really make some big changes in the planet. And so now that I'm getting on to my sort of last third of my life kind of thing, you know, you have the first third, which is where you're growing and developing, your second third where you're kind of doing, and then your last third where you're kind of contemplating and giving back. So I'm just transitioning into that phase. So that's part of my role at UFV now, is the experience I've gained in innovation entrepreneurship in BC, and trying to help people at the starting end of that too.
So if you think of that period, your university is not easy. You're diving into it.
I loved it. I mean,
there were no failures, no setbacks.
Tons. You have to fail. You have to fail to succeed. I mean, failure is not. It's success and failure is not a binary thing.
Right.
Failure leads to success, and learning how to fail. I think it's not something we need to teach. We need to teach people these days is how to fail. And how to fail forward and fail quickly and experiment all the time and do tests. And I mean, I was in science, and that's part of what you learn in science. You know, right from the undergraduate, you're doing these experiments, and they always fail, and you figure out why they failed, and you do them again, your sources of error and all that. So, and my PhD thesis, certainly, I mean, it had to overcome. It had never been done before, well, like most theses, but I was actually measuring pressures and forces on the surfaces of fish. It was in mathematical biofluid dynamics, and that had never been done. So it took a long time. I had to overcome a lot of hurdles there to get that done. But then once you succeed,
So we all understood that last sentence?
Once you succeed, there's so much satisfaction there, so much joy, and I think there's you want to persevere, but you also have to learn how to pivot. So there's no point in just banging your head on the wall if it's not going to go in your favor. So you also have to learn how to pivot and say, well, maybe I'm just looking at the problem the wrong way, and maybe if I start thinking about the problem this way, then I'll find the solution.
And you ended up at Cambridge in the UK.
Eventually, as a postdoc, yep. And I was in the early 90s. Exciting times because the sort of the Human Genome Project was just ending, and I was watching this whole burgeoning biotech industry around Cambridge that was happening. There's a lot of pharmaceutical companies there that help support the research, and there's a huge industrial research park around Cambridge, not just for pharmaceuticals, but a lot of that there. So it was really exciting to see. And of course, Cambridge, the world's smartest and best of everything, come to Cambridge.
Right.
So it was an opportunity to see those people and even meet people like Stephen Hawking and
Wow.
and it's a tiny little town. The downtown part of it, there's only about 8 or 10,000 students at Cambridge. Half of them are postdocs and graduate students. So yeah, it was an exciting time for sure. I loved it there.
So what were you doing there from a study
Well,
point of view?
Yeah, I was actually in the Department of Zoology and Comparative Physiology. So that's looking how organ systems work in different animals to see how things evolved. But of course that involved in that day and age a lot of molecular biology techniques as well. But my expertise is in what they call mathematical biofluid dynamics. So it's more like physics and engineering, but we just looked at animal systems to see how birds fly and fish swim and that sort of things. Turns out, 4 billion years of evolution has given them some advantage. So
Right.
so they figured that stuff out. So we still got a lot to learn from animal life for sure.
So if you could dumb it down for me and perhaps some of the audience, just some of them, what's the crux of some of the things that you were working on or discovering in that realm?
At that time, I was well. If you think of basic fluid dynamics, I was watching a NOVA program just the other night on supersonic flight. And they're talking about lift and drag. And
Right.
and weight, and so those are all sort of steady state because airplanes, they don't accelerate too. So I was looking at accelerated flows. So what happens with when you accelerate in a fluid? Air is also a fluid. It's not a liquid, but it's a fluid. And when you accelerate, all those physical laws kind of break down, and so a different set of rules apply. So that's what we were trying to learn from animals that accelerate very quickly in fluids, what principles were at work.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking you're looking at me like Neo from the Matrix and just seeing code and things flowing around me, but it's pretty cool.
Well, yeah, it's a lot of fun. I mean, we eventually down the road, there's a few patents came from that, from some automated submersibles, that sort of thing, so they can automatically adjust to current flows and things like that. So I think I'm on 3 patents in that realm, but that was really what I was interested in doing. I was just interested in pure science at that time.
So finished Cambridge. Did you come back to North America at that point?
Yeah, I did, and I came back, and I came back with this keen interest in what I was seeing. It was clear to me that this is the early '90s, that there's a revolution happening in the life sciences, and that the end of the Human Genome Project and this identification of genes that were responsible for disease and so on, that were targets for drugs, was a huge opportunity, and it certainly has been. And what I also realized was that I had an interest I was an entrepreneur at heart. I didn't know it at that time yet, but I was interested in business, and I was interested in the way that scientific discovery can be translated into economic development. And I saw a space there because I understood business, I understand investment, self-taught in investment and finance, but it's all just math, as it turns out. But then I had this understanding of the biomolecular world that most people in finance didn't have, and I had an understanding of finance that most people in the science world didn't have. So I found myself as an entrepreneur working as a consultant here in Vancouver, sort of interpreting between those two groups.
So you dive into entrepreneurship. What was the biggest? Obviously, it's a very different world than academia. What were some of those differences that you noticed?
The academia has to be an environment that's protected and cultured. People have to be protected. Their ideas have to be protected. They have to be given time, space, and money to do what they want to do. And in order to do that, there's a lot of security in the job. So when you're a tenured professor, essentially it's a job for life, and most people are jealous about that, but it's not the best paid job, I can tell you. But it does give you the security to go and explore and make those mistakes. But it sort of happens in a different way, because you're very dependent on funding, especially government funding, to do your research, and that means that you have to do the same. You guys are familiar with IRAPs and shreds and those sorts of things. You got to do the same thing if you're a researcher, and you almost have to have someone in your lab just working the grants. That's a full-time job, and so just the ability to go out there. What I love about the private sector, what I love about entrepreneurship, is the ability to move quickly, the ability to think and just think something up and go and do it. Going out to your network and say, listen, I got this great idea, and having people say, yeah, well, I can help you with this, I can help you with that. And that's one of the great things, by the way, I've been across Canada. One of the great things about the BC environment, it really is a supportive environment in the tech space in particular, but also in the entrepreneur and startup space. People are helping other people out, even if they're competing. They're still helping other people out, because I think people here realize that we're growing the pie. And everybody wins when we do that.
So as we have the entrepreneur hat on, but you probably had a thesis of why you're starting this business or this enterprise. Can you talk about what that looked like?
Well, I didn't really know at the time. I was just following the path of least resistance, like
Okay.
I always do, which is a fluid dynamic principle too. But I just thought it was just interesting to me. It was just interesting, and science often goes kind of too slow. And I tend to kind of go pretty fast, and it's really, from the time you have an idea in science till you design the experiments to the point where you can do some preliminary experiments to get the funding, get the people in your lab to do the research, it's like 5 or 10 years before you have a published paper. And that's just too slow for me. I like to, and I think actually it's too slow for the world right now. I mean, things are changing so quickly. That kind of pace we have to be patient with some of those things. People go, why don't we have a solution to this? Why don't we solve that problem? It's because it does move kind of slowly, and people are very careful, and there is a high standard there, and you can't take the same risk when you're using other people's when you're using government money, because you just won't get any more, right? So there's a little bit more risk tolerance, a little bit more in the private sector, a little bit more. Understanding of the fact that experimenting, failing, moving forward, and always like that. I think it's the grit. You just got to have grit, and I kind of admire grit. So and I'm not as involved as most of the audience is, directly as an entrepreneur. I mean, I do have my own business and so on, but I watch a lot of it happen, and it's really exciting to see happen. The energy is so amazing. There's so many young, smart people. And they're out there, and they're not just doing something that interests them, but what I see, especially with younger people today, is the triple bottom line. They're looking for things that are environmentally sustainable, that are socially responsible, and also profitable. And thankfully, profit isn't a bad word, and business isn't a bad word. And sometimes in an academic institution, there is a whole group of people there who just don't want to have anything to do with that. And in fact, some people think it's patently wrong. They just don't believe in capitalism or whatever, and that's fine if they want to do that. And a university is probably a good place for them, because they're not going to do very well in the marketplace. So, I'm a little. I just don't. It's not a political thing.
Right.
I just view because I'm a biologist. I kind of view animals out there surviving, and so you want to survive. Well, ultimately, you got to depend on yourself, and there's no better way to learn how to depend on yourself than to become an entrepreneur, and go out there and put your sweat on the line and take the risk. And fail and fall down and skin your knees and get up and say, okay, let's go. Let's try again, right?
So with that entrepreneurial endeavor, from what I understand, you had built a hedge fund?
Yeah, I co-managed a hedge fund for about 4 or 5 years in the biotech space.
In the biotech space?
Yep.
Can you talk about some of the wins and failures that you invested in?
Yeah, well, we were doing a lot of pretty elaborate derivatives, so we were doing a lot of derivative trading, and that's the best way to manage the risk in that. So if you know what a bull call spread is, that's sort of simple derivative trading where you sell against a buy. So
you weren't betting on particular horses as much as a...
we definitely were that too, but we always had ways of hedging rather than just say buying a stock and selling it at a different point. We would always hedge that.
Got it.
Which is the real idea of a hedge fund. And that was a lot of fun. I learned a lot. I learned a ton about how those derivative markets work and so on. But after about 5 years, my partner was he was really getting interested in real estate, and I was just really getting interested in the nutritional science that I'm working in now. And we'd made some money, and we just decided, you know what, we're either gonna choose our paths. And we both said, you know what, we made about over the 4 or 5 years, we averaged about 20% a year. But not every year. We had some 40% years, and we had some minus 20 years. But overall, we decided we'd done enough, but that wasn't what we wanted to do. So we just kind of cashed in and went on from there.
So talk about that chapter. You mentioned nutritional science and being a passion and an area of focus.
Yeah, that came from the health side of things. So I had a radio program called Think for Yourself. It was on Co-op Radio here in Vancouver for about 3 or 4 years a while back. And we had I was kind of, the current affairs kind of health person on there. We would talk about all kinds of different things, whether they're political, social, or whatever. And we had a guest on named Dr. Richard Mathias from UBC, and we were talking about what's the best way to lose weight. Is it through diet or through exercise? And we were going to have this debate, and there was a real aha moment there where he was sitting across from me. I'd been teaching for 30 odd years, teaching health and teaching, obesity is this, multivariate, complex, psychosocial thing that, was so complicated and had all these other, and he just looked at me and he just sort of said, Dave, it's not, it's overconsumption of carbohydrate. And I'd been teaching anatomy and physiology for more than 30 years, and at that one moment I just said, oh my God, you're absolutely right, because all of the other factors just clicked into place in my mind about insulin resistance and inflammation and how obesity works and all of the physiology background. And so I thought, I got to change my research, and I just decided to focus on ketogenic diets, which are very low carbohydrate diets, and so I've been doing that since for the last 7 years, I guess. I designed and adopted a ketogenic diet, which I've been eating for I lost about 27 pounds of body fat. And I was, by the way, I was not overweight even. I was totally fine and perfect health, but I just had, I was getting the mid-age kind of spare tire. And so that disappeared in about 12 weeks, and I thought, well, there's something here. And so I spent a couple of years just researching all the research on nutritional science and designed this diet, and then I've been involved in various studies. So right now, it's a 3-year clinical study. I'm working at the BC Cancer Research Centre, Dr. Jerry Crystal's lab, and we're collaborating with Jeff Volek's lab at Ohio State University in the Wexman Comprehensive Cancer Research Center. And it's a 3-year study on women with metastatic breast cancer. And we're looking at the effects of a ketogenic diet on women with metastatic breast cancer, which is stage 4, it's terminal breast cancer. And we're right in the middle of the study, so they're very expensive studies, very elaborate studies, but so far it's very, very promising. But I can't say much more because it's still early days. But I am writing a book, though. I've actually just got the galleys, so it's a book called BioDiet.
Okay.
And it's for the lay public to understand not just how to do a ketogenic diet. There's, you can go on the internet and find that stuff out, but it's more about why it works. So I'm using my background as a teacher to try and help explain why ketogenic diets work and how they, for most people, they're not for everyone, but for most people, how they can really improve your health and prevent chronic disease and probably treat most of the serious chronic disease, in particular very good for diabetes, cardiovascular disease, we're hoping cancer, but other things like epilepsy, Parkinson's maybe, and others.
Yeah, my first run-in with you was at TEDx Abbotsford, and I heard your TED Talk on that topic, and you were particularly enthralled with the government's viewpoint on what they put out. And can you talk a bit about some of the misinformation that you feel is there?
I'll need another drink for that.
Fair enough.
The Canada Food Guide. Governments aren't generally on the bleeding edge of science, and their policies are for the general public, and they're not directed towards an intervention for treating disease specifically. Right. So they're recommended. But I have to applaud Health Canada because there are some improvements in the food guideline, because virtually nobody was paying any attention to the old one, that rainbow thing, and nobody's paying any attention to that whatsoever. So it was useless. So they came up with a new one, and they do have some positive things. I mean, drinking water is probably better than drinking fruit juice, and getting sugar out of your diet's good, and preparing your own food and buying real food is important. I was just chatting earlier about the fact that I think the Fraser Valley is just an amazing potential as a foodie destination. We've got all these craft beers and craft cheeses, and we produce a lot of food, and it's just I could just see this becoming a destination spot for foodies, as well as for tech. I can see that happening too. But yeah, the Canada Food Guide, generally it's more the same, and I don't think it's a one size fits all recipe that's largely focused on plant-based proteins, and it's a very high carb, low fat diet, and I just don't think that's the right single prescription for the general public. I don't believe in one size fits all, but I don't think recommending a high carb diet is wise, frankly. So I'll stick
My
my
wife's
neck
in the
out on
my
that one.
wife's in the audience, and I've never heard audible nodding before, but I think she's getting a lot out of this talk.
Well, funny, it's it depends who you're talking to, but
So pizza and beer probably not recommended.
yeah, I love pizza and beer, but I just don't eat it anymore. But I do like grass-fed butter. I don't know if you've tried grass-fed butter, you can't stop eating that. Like, I don't crave that. People go, "Don't you crave like bread?" Because I'm half Italian. So don't you crave like pasta and bread and stuff? And I go, you know what? I actually don't, but I do crave like grass-fed butter or triple cream brie cheese, and I put full-fat dairy in my coffee, and I actually think the dairy producers, the egg producers, and the cattle producers, and anybody who's producing animal, they got shortchanged by that latest Canada Food Guide, and I don't think that's a good thing at all. I think we produce in a very responsible way. We produce sustainably animal protein. I think we can continue to do that. So I just don't agree with some of the philosophy behind what we've seen.
Well, that gives us a good picture of where you came from and where the path you've taken. How did you end up at UFV?
Well, when I came back from Cambridge, it was a time when my stepmother was ill and my father was starting to get early stage of dementia, and I just needed to get a job. And one popped up, and I came out and I interviewed and got the job, and I've been here 25 years, so
Wow.
Something must have worked. I think this is my 25th year. And I actually started in biology, but when we started a degree in kinesiology, I moved over after just a few years, so I've spent almost all that time in kinesiology. And teaching health courses and anatomy, physiology, and pathology. And I've enjoyed it there. I've watched it grow from, it was actually University College when I joined. It started, if you don't know, it started here in Chilliwack, really, in church basements and high schools and as Fraser Valley College. Yeah,
and then it moved to the motel, they called it just over here.
And we had that until not too long ago. And we've grown and expanded, and Abbotsford's grown, and then we now have the new CEP campus out here in Chilliwack. And we have more programs and more students, and everything's just about doubled in the 25 years I've been there. But we still got a ways to go. We're calling ourselves a university now, the University of the Fraser Valley, and we're under a different kind of framework politically. The government act that governs us is the Universities Act. So there are certain responsibilities and so on we have in an administrative structure, but also we have a role to play in the community where we are responsible for, not just providing courses for people to get degrees, but for actually interacting with the community, determining what the community needs are in terms of education, skills, and training, and responding to that. And also to help to foster the economic development of the community. I mean, anywhere you see areas of development, tech development, entrepreneurship, or you're going to see it near a university, right? So you look at the Bay Area, or you look at around in Massachusetts, or you look at Mumbai or London or anywhere in the world. They're all surrounding universities, and that's where a lot of the new intellectual property is coming from, and it gets commercialized around there. But even those commercializations start spinning off their own second rounds of entrepreneurship and so on. And so I think we can play a bigger role there, the University of Fraser Valley. I hope we do. We do have a new president, Dr. Joanne McLean, who was my dean before of health sciences. And Joanne has said, the innovation is in the DNA of the university. And so we're hoping to not just to innovate ourselves, but to work with the Fraser Valley community to innovate collectively here, so that we can again work. It's kind of like innovating to innovate. You know, in order to create a new model for which we can work with the community, we have to change ourselves. So that's part of what I'm hoping to achieve.
So about half a year ago, Joanne tapped you on the shoulder and said, "Can you lead up innovation and entrepreneurship?" Or how did that conversation go?
It's more the other way around.
Okay.
And it was more Craig Toes, who I know you
Got
guys
it.
know. Craig Toes is our Vice President External.
Yep.
And so we'd been on a committee together that was looking at the new digital media programming that we were, we have 3 areas of programming. One is agriculture, one is health, and one is digital media.
Mm-hmm.
So we were on a committee together, and we kind of liked the way each other were thinking about this. And I just said, well, you know, I have this other role we haven't really discussed yet with the Discovery Foundation, and in that role, I have quite an extensive network in the tech space in
Right.
BC, and why don't we leverage that for UFV's benefit? So so I'm still a professor there, but I do a little less teaching, and I've taken on this interim role as Director of Innovation Entrepreneurship. So that has sort of three parts to it. One is interacting with levels of government. Municipal, provincial, and federal. Some of the initiatives that we want to enact, they'll require money, and some of that has to be public money. And then part of it is connecting with community organizations, like the organizations here. And I have to say, Chilliwack is really, you know, very, very high on the radar in BC in general. You guys are punching way above your weight, and that's recognized everywhere. And so we got to draw on some of the energy that you guys have produced here, and you provide a great model for how you get organizations like this, like Startup Grind, going. I mean, those kinds of things really make a difference. They really do. So partnering with you on that is great. The third role is actually to look at the culture within the university, and universities are very risk intolerant institutions. I'm not talking about just ours; they are in general. They're very hierarchical. You know, it comes from thousands of years. We've had universities, and they have, you know, deans and presidents and so on. So to try and work innovation into that is a challenge, because as this group, I think, knows, innovation doesn't happen in hierarchies. It happens in networks. And so what I'm trying to do is build networks within the hierarchies. And I'm trying to keep myself removed, and the we call I&E at UFV, Innovation Entrepreneurship at UFV, try and keep that out of the hierarchy as much as I can, and just create a network which is supported by the administration, but kind of hands off, and just let me do my thing for a year or two and see what we can do. So we've got a number of initiatives that are kind of fun.
You twigged my mental notes of what I'm going to talk to you about, because you've got so many different hats you're wearing, but you are currently the CEO of the Discovery Foundation, and you're previously a board member with that. Talk about that and how that is coming to what you're doing now.
Sure. Well, I love talking about that, because it's something I'm very proud of. The Discovery Foundation was started back in the 80s when it was Minister Pat McGeer was looking around at the universities, and there's a lot of intellectual property being developed, mostly in the life sciences, and looking for ways to commercialize that. And I don't even know if we called it intellectual property then, but it was the commercialization of intellectual property, or tech transfer. So he went to the VPs of research at all the big universities and said, what do you need? And they sort of looked around and said, well, we have teaching labs, we have research labs, but we don't have commercialization space on universities. And space is always, you know, utmost value at universities. If there's an inch, someone will claim it and want to use it. So having commercialization space at a university was just kind of a new thing. So some, you know, land was put aside, and some capital was put aside, and Discovery Parks, it's now Discovery Parks Investments Limited. It was Discovery Parks Realty Corporation before that. And so we built about 2 million square feet of space in and around the universities, around BCIT and UBC, over the last 30 years. And then in around, so this is for profit too, but in around 2010, the tax laws changed, and we were going to have a pretty heavy tax hit, which meant a lot of the money that was BC money was going to be going to Ottawa, which is okay too, but we'd like to keep it in BC. So we formed the foundation, which is a charitable organization, and rather than pay tax to the federal government, we just paid it into the charitable organization, and that kept that money here in BC. And so we do education, mentorship, research, and scholarship. So those are all charitable work, and we do that by engaging agents that provide those services for us. So some of you, I recognize women, Colin from Ace Tech, and a lot of the incubators, Viatech on the island and CAST, and then some of the universities like Venture Connections, E at UBC, those are the kinds of organizations that we engage, and then they provide our programming for us. And what we like best are sort of mentorship programs that provide the kinds of skills, like the ACE Tech one is sort of at the higher end. These are CEOs of growing companies that are revenue growing, and providing really high-end CEO training. And then at the lower end, we're all the way down into now, Kids Code Jeunesse, looking at teaching elementary school kids how to code. So all through the tech spectrum. So our sort of mandate is to foster the development and sustainability of tech in BC. But my elevator speech is we're the United Way for diversity and inclusiveness in the tech sector, because when I took over, I went back to the board and a bunch of white guys, basically. And I just said, we're a bunch of white guys, and there's something missing in the tech sector in BC, and it's representation from these underrepresented groups, women, First Nations, people with disabilities. And I just said, that's where I want to put our money, and they just said, go for it. So they've been completely supportive. So since then, we've been putting all of our money and encouraging our agents to provide programming for underrepresented groups in the tech sector.
So CEO title, is that obviously more than a title? How much time a week are you putting into that organization?
It's a lot of time sometimes, and then I go to about 120 events a year in relation to that.
Wow.
And that's why, my value proposition to UFV was I'm going to all these events anyway. If I haven't, a title and some responsibility, then I can start representing UFV at those, so that raise the profile of UFV. One of the good things about being the CEO of an organization that, so I like to say sometimes I go to parties and give money away, is you get invited to a lot of parties. So it gives me that door open. So for instance, tomorrow I'm meeting with Dr. Ellen Winter, who's the Innovation Commissioner. So I can get those meetings and talk to those people. And when I do, I'm always mentioning Fraser Valley, because I think it's going to be the no-brainer growth area for the tech sector in BC for a number of reasons. But the main reason is that Vancouver has a cost of housing problem. They're growing lots of companies and they're growing fast, but then they got nowhere to go. So what they're doing is they're selling out, or they're moving off into the States, or they're moving to Vancouver Island and that sort of thing. But we have a huge opportunity here in the Fraser Valley to develop the tech sector. So both as a Director of Innovation and Entrepreneurship at UFV, and with my CEO of Discovery, I'd like to help with both of those hats on to try and foster what's going on here in the Eastern Fraser Valley.
And in your portfolio with UFV now, one of the things you're implementing is design thinking.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us about what that is and how that applies and what you're doing with that?
Yeah, I really, I guess it was, I read a lot. and one of the things that's kind of fun about Discovery is I get to go I see a lot of speakers, I go to a lot of conferences, and I really got interested in design thinking about actually, it's the same thing. It was about the same time that I changed my research, because I realize now in hindsight that I used design thinking to figure out why ketogenic diets would be useful. And it's because, I'll come around and answer your question, but we have a lot of chronic disease problems. We have, obesity is epidemic. 62% of Canadians are now obese or overweight. It's more than 70% in the United States. Along with that are these other comorbidities like cancer, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, and diabetes. And what we're doing in our medical system, which, by the way, is not a healthcare system, it's a disease management system. They wait till you get sick, and then they manage it, usually with drugs and surgery and so on. And that's because they're responding. They're not using design thinking. They're saying, okay, here's a problem. It's diabetes. That's high blood sugar. Let's just lower the blood sugar. Well, there isn't a single diabetes drug that actually treats the disease. It just manages the progression of the disease, and it it doesn't end well. But if we start thinking, why are all these things rising in concert with one another? And there must be some deeper problem that is the root cause of that problem. And when I look at that deeper problem, it's all at the mitochondrial level, so it's to do with our metabolism. And if we actually change our metabolism, which you can do through diet without drugs, and see what happens, it turns out that all these things, they all resolve for most people, for about 7 out of 8 people, they resolve, and quickly. Like we've had people with type 2 diabetes for decades that within 4 weeks, they're not needing any medication anymore. It's really hard to prove. So that's what design thinking is in its core. Is if there's one word, and I know there's lots of design thinkers in the room, and they're teaching this in school now, so the elementary school kids are learning it. But the first and probably most important step is empathy, is thinking of the end user. If you're thinking about your product or your service that you're providing, always keeping that in mind. How is this going to affect the end user? Because sometimes we get into our own little blinkered worlds and we don't see that, right? And then the second thing, which I could quote Einstein or others, is to really be, just be curious, have that situational awareness, look for problems, look for things that could be made better. Always thinking about improving. That's the sort of Kaizen, continual improvement. And so when you identify these problems, the next thing to do is to actually spend a lot more time than we do thinking about the problem. Because what we tend to do is we have the problem and we start thinking about solutions right away. Well, this is the problem, this must be the solution. And that can lead you down the wrong path and be very expensive for some people. So it's worth spending some time thinking about the problem. Einstein said, I'm not smarter than anybody else. I'll think about the problem a lot longer than the rest of you will. And he would spend like 30 years thinking about grand unified theory, never got that one right. But they also said, to Einstein, another quote, and I don't even know if he said this, right? Because he's said so many things he's supposed to have said, and half of them he didn't. But evidently he was asked, if you had an hour to solve a problem and your life depended on it, how would you go about it? And he said, well, that's easy. I would spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem, and then I would just easily solve it in the last 5 minutes. And so we do the other thing. We just think about the solutions all the time. So the second step of design thinking is, being aware of the problems, but also thinking about the problem, and is there a deeper root problem? So in the case of chronic disease, is there a deeper? I think there is. And it turns out the ketogenic diets not only help all these diseases resolve, but because they work at the mitochondrial level, they help these other things like epilepsy, Parkinson's disease, even PCOS, acne, all kinds of stuff, because they have the same root cause. So it's a more effective way of dealing with things. If we look at, people talk about, the climate change, global warming. They talk about famine. They talk about droughts. They talk about urban blight. They talk about, I just keep hearing this all the time, and I go, you'll never solve any of those problems because you're just solving the symptoms. The problem that we have to address there is there's too many humans on the planet, right? And until we start rethinking, when I was a kid, I'm older than I think almost all of you here, but we had this thing it was called ZPG. It was from the States, so it was ZPG, not ZPG, zero population growth. And when I was born, there was 3 billion people on the planet. We're now approaching 8. That's in my lifetime. And at that time, we knew that if we didn't do something about population growth, we were going to be in big trouble. And then we just forgot about it for like 50 years. And now we're going, oh my God, we got all these problems, and now the problems they're way worse than they could have been had we addressed it earlier. And until we start looking at those sorts of solutions, because we add 11,000 humans every hour. So, within a day, that's the sort of population of the Fraser Valley we're adding to the planet every day. Every 10 days or so, we're adding the population of Vancouver to the planet. Every 10 days, the whole population of Greater Vancouver. And in a month, we're adding another London or Paris every month. And that's just the increase, right? And all those people, also higher standard of living, higher energy consumption, greater food demands, all that sort of thing. It's such a no-brainer. So again, being a biologist, I go, well, we're not, until we get at the root of that problem, all these other problems, we can throw money at it forever, but we're going to have to solve that problem eventually, or nature will solve it for us, and nature is pretty good at doing that. And we don't want to go down that road if we can avoid it.
Okay, I'm going to reel you back in a bit and talk back.
But I diverge.
No, that's totally fine. I think you're giving us all
digress.
a master's degree in biology in a half an hour. It's amazing. So with your role of taking all of this and trying to kind of bring that empathy, bring that design thinking, bring that entrepreneurial spirit and innovation, what have you noticed in this 6 months of trying to wrap your head around this at the university?
Well, the university is going through a change because we have a new president. That's always exciting. It's always a time of opportunity. Again, humans actually don't usually like change, but I view change as a good thing. I think it's a time for opportunity. I think it's a time to rethink things, and it's time to move forward. I'm, the more time I spend in the Fraser Valley, the more I realize that my first thought about it being a no-brainer for the future, it's just reinforced every day. I just meet great people, there's great ideas, so much energy, and so much opportunity here. If you look at where we are nestled between the water and the border and the mountains, but we've got this fantastic, some of the most productive agricultural lands on the planet. We've got great learning opportunities, not just at UFV, but UFV's central here in the Eastern Fraser Valley, but other great universities here. We've got really educated people, we've got great schools, we've got a beautiful environment, we've got mountains to ski at, we've got a river, we've got this tremendous history in the First Nations populations here, and they're reaching out to cooperate and to progress in economic development as well through the Stalo Community Futures, and it's just this beautiful lifestyle, this fantastic place. We've got, despite what we might think, we've got great government, we've got good health care, and everybody wants to come here, and we just, I think people that live here know that, but I don't think you guys realize how good you have it right now and how much potential there is here. And what I hope to do is if we can somehow harness all that energy and that positivity, and start really planning out how we want things to go, that'll probably go better than if Amazon comes in with $1 billion and decides to have a fulfillment center, right? That can really change your environment. I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, but they might have the potential to do that. So I think having a really good collective, not just an economic plan, but a social plan for the future here in the Fraser Valley there's just so much potential here, and I think it's going to be in 20 years. It's going to be one of the leading tech sectors in the country, if not the continent, and all kinds of technology, aerospace, agrotech, ICT, AR, VR, data, AI. I think that can all happen here, and it's all starting to happen now. I think it's also going to become a really interesting foodie destination. I think with all the focus on the food we have here, and not just the 100-mile food, but food production and so on. There's a great opportunity there. Even in ketogenic diets, if that catches on, then there's going to be a lot more opportunity for people to develop food products as well that are just higher fat, lower carb. So there's that tremendous possibility there, and it's a young, well-educated population. The future is yours, man. I mean, I'm just trying to see if I can help UFV facilitate all of that happening, and what we can do to help, because we can train and educate people, we can give them skills, but we've got more to offer than that. The faculty there have all kinds of expertise that is underutilized right now, and we need to connect the faculty and their expertise to the communities better as well.
It may be premature, and you might not want to make an announcement or anything at this point, but if you saw some outcomes with UFV reaching out to the community and doing that commercialization of research, and what would that look like in a perfect state?
Physically?
Yeah.
Well, we'd like to have one, or I would argue a number of innovation centers and or incubator accelerators. I mean, they can all be one and the same. So an innovation center, what I have in mind is something more, if any of the folks here are familiar with the MIT Media Labs, that was an experiment that was done back at MIT in I think the 80s. And it's not just about tech people, but it is about tech people. But it's getting tech and science and musicians and artists and food people and athletes and putting them in the same space, because when you get that thought and talent diversity, that's where these little nexuses is nexuses, is that plural? I don't know. Nexi. That's where those things happen, where all of a sudden you get a new explosion of things. So you look at something like wearables, like Fitbits and that sort of thing, which is a combination of tech and sport, and this is all kinds of ways that those things can happen. The media arts, the way technology has affected the media arts. I mean, VR and AR is just going to absolutely, people talk about AI all the time and how that's going to change the world, and the fourth industrial revolution. I don't think people are even starting to understand how much AR and VR are going to be available and affect our lives in ways that we just can't imagine. I mean, why why go to Hawaii when you can put the headset on and, you know, turn on the lamps and just
Okay.
be there virtually?
You had my wife earlier, you just lost her.
She doesn't like Hawaii?
No, it doesn't like the goggles and the whole.
Well, we got to work on that.
Okay.
I'll let you guys sort that one out. But no, that's all coming eventually. And I think also in education, we have, and I've frankly I've been quite outspoken by the fact that we could be Napstered out of our jobs. You know, if you look at what Google's doing now in education, you look at what Microsoft's doing now in education, you look at what young people are looking for, and they're going, well, why would I want to go to this institution to get, you know, this piece of paper after 4 years that says I have this degree, and it may or may not get me a job. It might be fun, and I might learn stuff, and I might, you know, be a better person and a better citizen as a result. But most people, when they're young, are thinking about their careers. They go, why don't I just go and work at Google where they'll pay me to get all this training and learn this stuff, and I can go out into the space that I want to be in. If we're not careful at the universities, and you know, I was talking to a guy from the University of Texas recently who was just saying, University of Texas, one of the biggest universities in the United States, is looking at we could implode. Because if you look at the opportunities for VR and AR in the educational space, for example, if we're just going to stand up there, you know, with our PowerPoints and talk at the front of a room, people aren't going to buy into that if they can have these massive, you know, immersive educational experiences brought right to a headset. Think about it.
Well, when you think of commercialization of ideas that start at universities, what's the ideal role from some of the research you've been doing and even been involved in? How does stuff start there and make its way to consumers, and what role, like, is it equity? Is it just more of a here you go world? How does that work?
Different models at different universities. Some of the universities just claim rights to all of the intellectual property, so UBC is one that does that. So anything that's developed at UBC belongs to UBC. That's their model. And if they will actually do the work to go out and see if there's any commercial viability to that intellectual property. They'll go out and get the angel investors. They'll start the company. Usually the inventor becomes the president of the company, gets some equity shares, so there's a win there for sure. Some other universities don't want to have any equity at all. And I think, you know, that's probably a more common model. And in that case, I think what seems fair is, for instance, if you're or your son comes to UFV and develops some kind of intellectual property there, and the university spends the money to help them develop that and gets the patents, which are expensive, and helps put the company together and that sort of thing, then, you know, I think the university should get their money back from that and not worry too much about the equity. But then, if it fosters a more vibrant economic community and the university is demonstrated to be playing a role there, I think the hope is that the community recognizes that and gives back to the university through charitable donations, because all the universities are charitable organizations, so they can issue charitable donations. And, you know, that's how a lot of the big universities in the United States work, like the non-state universities. They get massive endowments, and some of them do own intellectual property and make money from that as well, but they get massive endowments and from their graduates who have been successful. So we're hoping, you know, we're still pretty new. We're only 40 years old and a little bit, and we're still hoping that some of our graduates will be successful. And if we can get involved with entrepreneurship and developing companies that are successful in a meaningful way, then we hope that, you know, when that CEO or that C team gets their exit, that maybe they give a little back to UFV, and then we'll just do more with it.
Right.
We can build more maker spaces. You were talking about what it's going to look like physically. I see these innovation centers, these multidisciplinary spaces. And by the way, I've recommended to the university, don't put those on campus. I recommend a number of them and put them, you know, downtown or just off campus or whatever, and make them community buildings so that the community is just as welcome as any of the students are. Get that collaboration going between the community and the university. And then I think every city, town, whatever, should have one or more incubators too. Maybe different focuses at those incubators, but I mean, really, you could this with some mentorship would become an incubator, right? So just getting the expertise in from people that have had that experience to help people avoid the major pitfalls and help them over those hurdles and learn how to pivot and even just learning how to do pitches and you know, raise money. All of that I think is what we can play in. So hopefully I would like to see the UFV banner. Thank you for showing it tonight. But I would like to see that on little little places all over town and,
Yeah.
and all throughout the valley here. The other way to go is, the one big thing, and then you fight over where it's going to be
Right.
and who's going to own it. And we did just purchase the restaurant and entertainment plaza next to the Abbotsford campus. My personal feeling is I would love to see that become a food innovation center because it's got an amazing commercial kitchen in there. I would like to see world-class chefs come in and have like television chef contests and show people the Fraser Valley, just give them Fraser Valley foods and say, here, go to it. What can you make from this stuff? Because we've got just fantastic opportunity in food here. And food innovation is food, like in North America, is a $3 trillion a year business, processed food. So it's not a small little economic engine. So if you can get involved with food innovation, there's some real exciting opportunities there.
Well, fascinating. Let's hear it for Dr. David Harper.
Thank you.
We've got a bit of time to do some Q&A. I'm tapped out for questions, but I'm sure there's plenty in the audience. Michael, can you run anybody want to raise their hand and ask a question?
It can be about anything, but I promise I will give you an answer. So.
So just a question about ketogenic diets, right?
Sure.
High fat, low carbs. Do you have to worry about your cholesterol increasing and all that, or not?
That's a very good question. And I'll first say I'm not a physician. So if you have issues with cholesterol, that's who you should be talking to. But it's actually a more complicated question than you think. The first question is cholesterol a good proxy for cardiovascular risk? And I will just state the facts, is that half of people that have cardiovascular accidents, which are strokes, heart attacks, and so on, have absolutely normal LDL, which is the only one they focus on in the medical community right now. There are better markers for cardiovascular disease, HDL, which is the good cholesterol they don't really look at, triglycerides and so on. So there are a proportion of people on, because there's cholesterol will rise, both HDL and LDL, with saturated fat consumption. Now, if you don't want to do that, you don't have to, but saturated fat on its own doesn't correlate with any disease at all, despite what Health Canada thinks. And I say that as a scientist, not as a physician, but it doesn't correlate with any chronic disease on its own. When you mix it with high glycemic index carbohydrates, it does, but it's actually the carbohydrate that's causing the problem. So your LDL can rise, but there's 3 types of LDL. And only the small particle size one is the one that correlates with cardiovascular disease. And you'd have to get your particle size measured, and we don't actually even have the capability of measuring that in Canada. So you'd have to go south of the border to do that. Because what happens on a ketogenic diets are high fat, so you're transporting more fat around. So when you transport that fat, you need more fat carriers, and that's what LDL does. But it's the light, fluffy ones that are carrying it around, and they don't correlate with chronic disease. So that's a good way to start a fight at a cardiologist conference, is to talk about LDL. Personally, mine's fine. My HDL is about tripled since I've been on a ketogenic diet, and that's the so-called good cholesterol. My triglycerides are rock bottom. My blood sugar is right at 4 all the time when I measure it. My ketones are usually 1.52 all the time. So if it's a well-formulated ketogenic diet, we also have to, one of the criticisms about it, and I could go on a long time about this. I love talking about this stuff. People say, well, there's no long-term studies that show whether ketogenic diets are safe or not. And I go, well, hold on for a second there. For about 2 million years, humans managed to evolve without any carbohydrate in our diet. So I'd call that longitudinal. It's got a few million years of success. Somehow we got to where we are today. And there are actually some other clinical studies that have gone on for a couple of years. But for sure, you need to talk to your physician if you're going to think about a ketogenic diet, because there are some contraindications for it that only they can measure and be aware of. But for about 7 out of 8 people, in my experience, through the trials I've done, they will respond positively, and all of those indicators will correct themselves. In fact, I've got a slide that shows about 30 different biomarkers, and they all improve, including reduction of need for pharmaceuticals. One will increase, and that's LDL. And so your family physician will look at that, well, your LDL's going up, can't be good for you, so you better go on a statin, right? And you'll just get Alzheimer's and stuff, because statins give you Alzheimer's.
Do you have a question about innovation or entrepreneurship?
I told Tim not to talk about the ketogenic diet stuff, because
do you combine intermittent fasting with your ketogenic
you
diet?
can if you want to. Yeah, I intermittent fast between about 8 o'clock at night and about 8 the next morning. So I call it sleep. That's why I call it breakfast. Breaking the fast. But what I say is, people go, can you be vegan and do it? Yeah, you can. But if you're vegan, whatever's working for you, if it's working, then stay with it. If intermittent fasting is working for you, then go for it. Intermittent fasting is kind of like ketogenic light. The problem is, if you're intermittent fasting, but you're not also eating a well-formulated diet when you're eating food, you're probably it's gonna be a wash or even worse, right? But if like most people, as you get a little older, you start putting on weight, your blood sugar goes up, your blood pressure goes up, your lipids go up, you get into what we call metabolic syndrome, which is a pre-diabetic state. If that's what's starting to happen, then I think the responsible thing to do is, well, let's see if we can fix this with diet first, and if that fixes everything, then go with that, right? And if intermittent fasting is the solution, it's good. If it's a vegan diet, then that works for it. Well, yeah, and I mentioned that in my book. I talk a little bit about it. There are a lot of people there's more people on intermittent fasting diets than ketogenic diets for sure, because ketogenic is sort of more restrictive, right? You can't eat carbohydrate. But again, I would argue the ketogenic diet is the natural human state, so the closer you get to that, the better. But if you're getting success with intermittent fasting, then stay with it. But do it with your physician and monitor the right things. Yeah. My wife does that too sometimes. Yeah.
So I've got time for one more question, specifically about innovation, entrepreneurship, and the university. Yes, absolutely. No.
I'll stick around and answer a few more of
Yes.
those questions after.
Oh, you're not kidding.
Oh,
Okay.
you did have.
Statistics, at least up until a couple of years ago, failure rates for entrepreneurship is about the same as it was even 40, 50 years ago. And despite the fact that we have all of these amazing programs in universities, crowdfunding, all of these different things to support entrepreneurship, the failure rate is about the same, at least up the statistics up until a couple of years ago, are the same as they were 40, 50 years ago. And it's fascinating to me. Do you have any thoughts on why that might be?
We have our own, at Discovery, our own KPIs, which we're actually working up a package to give to the government. If those startups get the right kind of mentorship and support, I'm not talking about government handouts. I'm talking about the right kind of mentorship and support, the right kind of coaching, the right kind of advice. You can bump up from about from startup about a 5 to 10% success rate to almost 70%. So if you just take some kids in a garage in high school that have an idea, and you just let them go, they're probably going to fail, right? But if you provide them with the right kind of coaching support all the way through, like I'm talking about, there's CEOs out there. You're still learning, man. You're learning all the time. If you think you've learned everything, then you haven't learned anything. And there's always ways to move forward and be more innovative and make your company better and more profitable and so on. And so if they continually get that kind of coaching all the way through, then they're gonna. What our data shows is they'll be a lot more successful. So that's what we're trying to do with our little bits of money at Discovery, and we're trying to do that with underrepresented groups. But there are bigger programs, and that's what IRAP's trying to do, and that's what. The provincial government, they're maybe not quite as efficient as we are because they're big bureaucracies that, like we're about 92% efficient. So the money that we get, 92% of it goes directly into programming, goes directly back to you guys. If you're looking at government programs, at least 50% of that is eaten up in the bureaucracy before it ever gets down on the ground. And then there's a lot of, I don't know if you guys have done shreds or IRAPs or whatever. There's so much paperwork there, right? The application process, the accountability, and that's because it's public money, And the public wants people to be accountable, so the way you make them accountable is you make them do a lot of paperwork, but that just slows everything down. I mean, some companies have to hire somebody just to do the paperwork. So you know, I just believe that the more organic and grassroots, if I can get you with your expertise to talk to you, because I know the both of you, and you're in my network, and I know you can help each other out. That's what I find is working, and that's what we do have a lot of that. So you know, get coaches, get mentors, and network all the time, and build those networks. That's what I would like to do here in the Fraser Valley, is help to develop a network of networks. So get all of these organizations and groups into a broader one that can then speak to levels of government with one voice. When you're speaking to somebody like Western Economic Development, who start at, you know, $1 million grants, it's okay, we now have this critical mass of organized groups, and now we're going to do a big ask for a lot of money for some kind of project. You'll be more successful, I think, if you do that.
Well, let's hear it for Dr. David.
My pleasure.
I've got a couple housekeeping things. I just want to thank our team, myself, Colin, Michael, and Aidan, for putting this show on every month. Yes. We've got a way in front of it, and we've got our next 3 speakers booked, and you'll be happy to see some female faces. That was a goal. We've got Mary Jane. She's coming out from Vancouver, and she's got an app that she's developed to help multi-level marketers, and she'll be talking about the importance of follow-up. We've got Amber Price, a local success story with the Bookman, named Business of the Year by the Chamber of Commerce, so we're looking to hear her great story. And then Jared Falk, you probably haven't heard of him, but he's from Abbotsford and has a startup called Drumeo that has more than 250 million views on YouTube of drum lessons, a team of 30 that do live stream drum lessons every day. It's really cool. So do come out and support and be a part of this. Startup Grind Chilliwack. You bet. We do have time for some more networking, and there is some carbohydrates out there for snacks.